When we think of the past, it's easy to picture a world of prim and proper manners, devout religious zealots, and power-hungry men in stiff collars. But hold your horses, it wasn't all tea and stiff upper lips. In fact, the ancient elites of Rome, Greece, and Egypt were no strangers to public displays of passion. The 1800s saw people getting creative in their attempts to dodge the bedroom tango.
We'd have stood here, the lady would have been in whatever position here, and then so one lady there, and what's going on underneath?
There was probably another woman underneath.
The mind boggles, really.
With chastity devices, religious guilt, and a whole lot of repression leading the charge. People weren't just avoiding intimacy, they were engineering bizarre ways to keep it at arm's length. What extreme measures did they take? Join us as we unravel the shocking truth behind the Victorian obsession with control. The Victorian obsession and restraint. The Victorian era is often depicted as a time of societal restraint, with strict norms governing personal behaviour and interactions. It's easy to view this period through the lens of prudence, where ideals of modesty, chastity, and moral behaviour were upheld by the ruling class and the general populace alike. However, despite these outward signs of control, the reality of life in Victorian England was more complex and rife with contradictions. The Victorians tried to establish strict social boundaries in the name of decency, but these boundaries were often overrun by a silent undercurrent of sexual desire. While the upper classes might have engaged in secretive affairs and clandestine sexual practices, even common people were not immune to such behaviour. This tension between public morality and private indulgence created a paradoxical atmosphere in which repression coexisted with indulgence. Social rules dictated that sexuality should only serve the purpose of reproduction, a belief that the elite class, in particular, adhered to rigidly. To help enforce this, many devices and cultural practices were created to ensure people adhered to these ideals. But as history often shows, repression has a tendency to foster resistance in the form of underground cultures and subversive behaviors. As the 1800s progressed, ideas about sex became more rigid, yet creative methods to avoid it also flourished. The Victorians, known for their obsession with cleanliness, modesty, and moral purity, sought ways to avoid physical contact, even between married couples. In an era when physical touch was often viewed with suspicion, especially between the sexes, people went to absurd lengths to prevent sexual contact. This included elaborate clothing, avoidance strategies, and even the development of chastity devices aimed at curbing lustful desires. These devices were born out of a belief that sexual control was a necessary component of a disciplined and productive society. Despite these attempts at controlling human nature, society was rife with contradictions. Prostitution, for instance, was an integral but hidden part of Victorian life. While the ruling classes decried it publicly, it continued to thrive beneath the surface, providing a channel for individuals to release their sexual frustrations and desires. Additionally, the rise of pornography, though rarely discussed in public, became another vehicle through which people found outlets for their secret longings. These subcultures grew, often secretly flourishing in the corners of society where the moralizing authorities could not reach. The Victorian repression, it seems, bred more than just conformity. It also gave birth to a kind of sexual rebellion. Miss Grundy, the symbol of repression. One of the most enduring symbols of Victorian moralism and repression was Miss Grundy, a character who encapsulated the era's ideals of proper behaviour and moral constraint. Initially introduced in the 1798 play Speed the Plough by Thomas Morton, Miss Grundy was an offstage character who represented societal expectations of respectability and conservative values. Over time, her influence grew, and by the 19th century, the term Miss Grundy had evolved into a shorthand for any form of respectable restraint or extreme purity. Miss Grundy came to symbolize everything that was considered correct and proper by Victorian standards. Her character was based on the notion that the actions of individuals should always align with societal expectations, especially concerning sex, marriage, and public conduct. This ideal of perfection and virtue was at odds with the growing human desire for personal freedom, creating a tense and often suffocating atmosphere. The very name Miss Grundy became synonymous with social conformity and the pursuit of outward moral rectitude. regardless of the internal desires or needs of the individual. In a society where sexual activity was deemed appropriate only within marriage and for the sole purpose of procreation, any deviation from this standard was seen as both socially unacceptable and morally corrupt. Miss Grundy's fictional influence was so strong that individuals were driven to internalize her beliefs, constantly worrying about how their behavior would be judged by the community. In this environment, even a simple gesture like a kiss or an affectionate touch could be scrutinized under the watchful eyes of Miss Grundy, making intimacy and physical affection a source of anxiety rather than pleasure. Male chastity devices. Male chastity devices were among the most inventive, if not bizarre, tools created to control sexual desire in Victorian men. These devices were born out of the belief that men's sexual urges were both dangerous and counterproductive to a disciplined society. Men were often viewed as sexually insatiable, and as such, their needs were believed to require constant regulation. In an era where masturbation and extramarital sex were seen as dangerous and immoral, chastity belts and other devices provided a physical means of controlling male sexuality. The jugum, a device worn by men, was an early example of such control. Designed to be worn at night, it would dig into the wearer's skin whenever they experienced an erection, causing discomfort and waking them up. The idea was that this physical discomfort would prevent them from engaging in nocturnal emissions, a practice widely condemned by the Victorians. These devices were not just about control, they were a reflection of the prevailing societal belief that sexual pleasure was a luxury that should be avoided, especially by men who were expected to be industrious and focused on their work. Despite the growing popularity of these devices, there was no consensus on how effective they were in curbing sexual desire. What they did, however, was serve as a constant reminder of how sexuality was being framed by society, something to be controlled, restricted, and hidden away. These devices were, in a sense, the embodiment of Victorian anxiety about sex. While they may have been marketed as tools for moral betterment, they reflected deeper fears about losing control over something as fundamental as desire. For men, these devices often represented the harsh realities of a society that saw them as slaves to their biological urges, needing constant surveillance and regulation. While these chastity devices were predominantly designed to control men, they also revealed how the sexual landscape in Victorian England was fundamentally unequal. Women, too, were bound by the same rules of sexual purity, but they faced different kinds of pressure. Women's sexual desires were seen as either non-existent or inherently sinful. For women, the idea of pleasure was often linked with deviance, and any woman who sought out sex for reasons other than procreation was viewed as morally corrupt. The introduction of male chastity devices, while primarily focused on controlling men's desires, highlighted how rigid and unyielding the norms surrounding sexuality were for everyone in Victorian society. Sexuality and shame. Prostitution was another key feature of Victorian society that both reflected and subverted the era's sexual norms. On the one hand, prostitution was a criminal act, a practice condemned by the social elite and governed by strict laws. On the other hand, it was an inescapable part of life for many people, particularly the lower classes, and continued to thrive despite the legal and moral efforts to stamp it out. Prostitutes were often viewed as fallen women, a term used to dehumanize them and suggest that they were morally corrupt for engaging in sexual acts outside of marriage. They represented everything that Victorian society despised: sexual freedom, financial independence, and defiance of the traditional family structure. While prostitutes were marginalized and stigmatized, their role in Victorian society was more complex than simply that of a criminal or social pariah. Prostitutes were often the only women who had the freedom to earn money independently of a male guardian. In a society where women were heavily dependent on their fathers or husbands for financial support, the freedom to support oneself was an attractive, albeit dangerous, option. Prostitutes were more likely to have financial independence, and some even had more personal autonomy than respectable women despite their marginalized status. The rise of prostitution during the Victorian era can also be understood as a response to the deep social inequalities that existed in the period. Women, particularly those from lower classes, faced immense pressure to conform to the strict moral and social expectations of the time. For many women, prostitution was the only available outlet for both sexual and financial freedom. Prostitutes often found themselves caught between the moral judgment of society and their desire for economic independence. Unfortunately, the stigma attached to their work made it difficult for many of them to escape their situation, even if they wished to. For the men who frequented brothels and other illicit establishments, prostitutes represented a convenient escape from the strictures of Victorian morality. While these men could freely engage in sexual activity outside of marriage, their actions often went unnoticed or unpunished, a stark contrast to the women who were vilified for doing the same. This double standard fueled growing resentment among women, many of whom began to call for an end to the patriarchal systems that allowed men to indulge their desires while condemning women who did the same. Strange superstitions. The Victorian era was rife with curious and sometimes downright bizarre superstitions, many of which revolved around sex and pregnancy. While science was beginning to make strides, many people still turned to folklore, myths, and old wives' tales to explain the mysteries of conception, childbirth, and child-rearing. These beliefs, often rooted in a mix of superstition and a deeply ingrained sense of propriety, governed how people viewed the act of sex and its consequences. From the positioning of bodies during intercourse to the emotional state of the parents, nothing was too trivial to influence the outcome of a pregnancy. One of the most peculiar beliefs of the time was that the location where sex occurred could dramatically impact the physical characteristics of the child. For example, there was a superstition that if a woman had sex while on the stairs, her baby would be born with a crooked back. The idea seemed to stem from the belief that certain physical actions, particularly those involving movement or instability, would somehow imprint upon the child, causing it to be born with deformities. Stairs, as an inherently unstable and dangerous location, were thought to magnify these risks. Even the emotional state of the parents during sex was seen as a powerful determinant of the child's future. If a woman wasn't fully present or emotionally invested in the sexual encounter, the resulting child was believed to be ugly and spiritless. This concept was tied to the idea that a mother's emotional energy and mental focus during conception would directly influence the vitality and beauty of the child. A lack of enthusiasm or genuine engagement in the act of sex was seen as a bad omen, suggesting that the resulting child would lack the energy, attractiveness, or social desirability of a more intimately conceived baby. Then there was the belief surrounding the child's gender. It was thought that the gender of the baby would be determined by which parent had the more pleasurable orgasm during sex. If the woman climaxes first, it was said that the baby would be a girl, while a male orgasm would result in a boy. This theory, while completely unfounded, was surprisingly widespread, showing just how deeply intertwined ideas of sexuality, gender, and even spirituality were in the Victorian mindset. The connection between sexual pleasure and gender determination reflected the era's complex attitudes towards sex, which were often viewed as a necessary evil or duty rather than a source of personal enjoyment. But these beliefs didn't stop with the act of conception. Victorian-era superstitions extended all the way through pregnancy and childbirth, with an array of rules designed to protect the mother and child from misfortune. For example, pregnant women were warned against certain foods, such as eggs, as it was believed that eating them could cause the child to be born with birth defects. If a woman gazed at a rabbit while pregnant, it was said that the child would be born with a hare lip, as if the rabbit's physical characteristics could somehow transfer to the baby. Moreover, the idea of sympathy played a key role in Victorian superstitions. It was thought that if a woman experienced pain or distress during pregnancy, it could directly affect her child's health or even lead to deformities. The psychological state of the mother was deeply intertwined with her physical well-being, and a perceived negative thought or event during pregnancy could manifest in physical consequences. Therefore, it was advised that women should maintain a calm and positive demeanor at all times to ensure a healthy pregnancy. Other superstitions suggested that the alignment of the stars and the moon played a role in determining the success of pregnancy and childbirth. Some believed that a baby born during a full moon would be cursed, while others thought that certain astrological signs could influence the temperament or intelligence of the child. Astrological charts were sometimes consulted to select the best time to conceive based on the alignment of celestial bodies. How Women Behaved. In a time not so long ago, the idea of a proper woman was tied tightly to the concepts of shame and ignorance, particularly when it came to her own body. Unmarried women were expected to be blissfully unaware of the physical realities of marriage, as if the knowledge of intimacy itself was something to be hidden from them until the moment of marriage, often revealed on or just before the wedding night. If a woman didn't exhibit this reluctance or discomfort, it was seen as a mark of poor character, even a flaw in her femininity. Karl Heinz, a German philosopher, wrote in The Rights of Women and Their Sexual Relations that this kind of shame was considered essential for a woman's dignity. He described it as the delicate shyness of a virgin stepping into the unknown, the feminine reserve that sought to guard her physical charms from the eyes of the world. According to Heinz, this kind of emotional shyness was not rooted in the fear of seeing something improper, but rather was viewed as an inherent quality that adorned a woman. The absence of this modesty, he argued, was a sign of dullness and coarseness, an indictment of the woman's character. This ideal of feminine shame wasn't just about modesty. It became a test of purity, a measure of a woman's worth. In fact, some even taught that a woman's ignorance of her own body was more important than the physical signs of virginity, such as the hymen. The belief was that if a woman displayed knowledge or ease about her body, it meant she had somehow failed at being proper. This prevailing mindset reinforced an entire culture of silence and secrecy around women's bodies, conditioning them to feel shameful, uncomfortable, or even fearful of their own natural desires and physicality. For these women, understanding their own bodies before marriage was not only unnecessary, it was seen as immoral. At the turn of the 20th century, sex education for women was a delicate, often guarded affair. It wasn't about fostering a deeper understanding of their own bodies, but merely about providing enough information to avoid complete ignorance. The prevailing belief was that women needed to know the bare minimum about their reproductive organs, just enough to satisfy societal expectations without sparking curiosity or a desire for exploration. In 1916, Maurice Bigelow, an influential figure in sex education, set forth a controversial approach to the subject in his book Sex Education, a series of lectures concerning knowledge of sex in its relation to human life. He argued that women should be taught the scientific names of their reproductive organs: ovaries, uterus, vagina, fallopian tubes, and vulva, because according to him, these dignified terms would maintain a proper attitude towards their bodies. However, the information should stop there. Any further exploration into the details of their anatomy, especially of the external organs like the vulva, was seen as dangerous. Such knowledge could, he warned, stir up curiosity and lead to irritation, a euphemism for self-exploration, which was deemed inappropriate. The underlying message was clear. Women were expected to accept their bodies as mysterious, even unknowable in some respects. The aim of this limited education wasn't to empower women with knowledge, but to preserve a sense of modesty and decorum. Their bodies were to remain distant and sacred, untouched by the curiosity that might lead them to understand their own desires or pleasures. The educational system of the time treated women's bodies as something to be kept in a constant state of passive ignorance. The more they knew, the more likely they were to question or investigate, something that, in the eyes of many, was seen as both immoral and disruptive to the ideal of feminine purity. The consequences of this sparse education were profound, as it left generations of women without the tools to truly understand their own bodies, their sexuality, and their rights over them. Marriage requirements. As women began asserting their right to control their own bodies, a new expectation emerged. Women who wanted autonomy in marriage needed to speak up before saying, "I do." It was a bold shift in thinking, challenging the long-standing belief that a husband had inherent rights over his wife's body. Men, however, argued that if a woman expected this change, she needed to make her position clear before the engagement. Otherwise, the husband would reasonably assume he was entering a marriage based on traditional expectations, where his rights over his wife's body were unquestioned. In 1918, Bernard McFadden, a well-known publisher and advocate for personal freedom, captured this tension in his book, Womanhood and Marriage. He acknowledged the rise of women claiming the right to bodily autonomy, but warned that these expectations needed to be disclosed to potential husbands before the wedding. Failing to do so, he suggested, would be akin to false advertising. McFadden wrote, "Since, however, it has been for so long a time an accepted idea that the husband's right over the wife's body was inherent, it is advisable for any young woman who takes the other point of view to make her attitude thoroughly understood by her future husband before she definitely takes upon herself the obligations of the marriage state." In the early 20th century, the role of a wife was bound by strict, often contradictory expectations designed to maintain the husband's authority while keeping the wife in a subservient, idealized position. It wasn't enough for a woman to just take care of her home and family. She had to do so in a way that protected the image of her husband, whose position in the marriage was often considered a direct consequence of the sin of the female sex. As William Jay once put it, the husband's authority was seen as a punishment for the inherent flaws of women. Wives were taught not to question their husbands or voice dissatisfaction, no matter the reason. Even if there was cause for criticism, it was deemed inappropriate for a woman to speak up. To do so would not only challenge the natural order, but would also undermine the very fabric of their marriage. A woman's duty was to be quiet and compliant, maintaining an aura of deference that supported her husband's position as head of the household. Further complicating matters, women were expected to hide any talents or ambitions that might stretch beyond the domestic sphere. Should a woman pursue a career or work outside the home, it would be a source of shame for her husband, as it implied that he was incapable of providing adequately for his family. This notion underscored the belief that a woman's worth was directly tied to her husband's success, or lack thereof, and her role was to support, not compete with him. A woman's appearance was another source of constant scrutiny. She was expected to be clean and tidy, but never so much that it made others uncomfortable. Fashion was encouraged, but not to the point of extravagance, lest it strain her husband's finances. Beauty was admired, but too much emphasis on it, especially if it involved makeup, was seen as an indication of vanity or promiscuity. The balance was delicate. She was to be attractive without appearing too accessible, striking without making her husband look weak. If infidelity entered the marriage, a woman's duty was clear: to remain silent. It was improper to discuss her husband's indiscretions, as cheating was considered a natural, almost expected part of male behavior. The Victorian Honeymoon. The Victorian honeymoon was far from the romantic tropical getaways we picture today. Instead, it was a complex and often awkward rite of passage, an intense period of transition that marked the shift from strangers to married partners. Spanning anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, this was often the first time a couple had ever been alone together. Given the constraints of the era, privacy before marriage was rare, so the honeymoon was a unique, deeply personal experience. During this time, the newlyweds would retreat to quiet, rural areas or seaside resorts. The idea was not just to celebrate the wedding, but to forge a new intimacy, and perhaps even to overcome the emotional awkwardness that came with sharing a life. This period was a strange paradox. While it was framed as the time to consummate the marriage, it was also a period of emotional discovery. For many, this was a time to learn about each other outside the gaze of family, friends, and society. Despite the fact that marriage was seen as the ultimate context for sexual fulfillment, the honeymoon often bore little resemblance to the blissful escapades we envision. One fascinating aspect of this era was the extreme reluctance to discuss anything related to sex. Most newlyweds, particularly women, were conditioned to treat sexuality as a taboo subject. Diaries and letters from honeymooners, studied by historians like Mishi, reveal that despite the intimacy of the occasion, most couples hardly referred to sex at all. The few mentions that exist are often vague, hinting at the cultural discomfort surrounding the subject. But not every couple was as fortunate. For some, the honeymoon became an awkward experience, marred by ill-informed notions of sex. The lack of proper education in matters of intimacy often left newlyweds confused and embarrassed. John Addington Symonds, an English poet, vividly recalls how Victorian society created a shameful atmosphere around sex. People were taught to be modest and ignorant about marital intimacy, and yet they were expected to perform the act with little preparation. Symonds describes the first night of marriage as one where couples blundered to the truth by instinct, a process that often caused more harm than good. Instead of joy and connection, many newlyweds experienced a sense of awkwardness that could last long after the honeymoon ended. Or explosion in plain sight. In the midst of the so-called Victorian age of modesty, when social codes and prudery ruled the day, one might be surprised to learn that pornography was thriving beneath the surface. Driven by advances in photography and printing technology, the 19th century saw an explosion in the production of erotic material, both written and visual, that despite the moral constraints of the time, was widely circulated and consumed. Far from being hidden in dark corners or tucked away under mattresses, Victorian erotica was openly sold on the streets of London and other major cities. One of the most notorious hubs for such material was Holywell Street, a location that has since become infamous for its blatant commercialization of sexual fantasies. Here in the open, passers-by could browse bookshops filled with titles that would make even the modern reader blush. These included works like an experimental lecture by Colonel Spanker, Captain Strokeall's pocketbook, and the story of a dildo, all of which featured lurid tales that would likely shock today's sensibilities despite their historical context. The kinds of stories that sold well during this period were not for the faint-hearted. The Victorians, much like people of any era, had their share of taboo desires, and these desires found expression in erotica. In these underground publications, readers could explore themes that were, even by contemporary standards, considered quite raunchy. Strap-ons, whippings, orgies, and other explicit sexual acts filled the pages of many of these works. Far from the quaint and restrained image often associated with Victorian society, these depictions revealed an undercurrent of unabashed sexuality that was very much a part of the cultural landscape, even if it was masked by public decorum. Perhaps most surprising, especially considering the criminalization of homosexuality during the period, is the fact that same-sex encounters were not entirely absent from Victorian erotica. While homosexuality was officially illegal, it did not stop artists and writers from producing explicit material that featured same-sex desire. These clandestine expressions of forbidden love found their way into written and visual works that were circulated quietly but persistently, indicating that the strict moral codes of the day were more porous than they appeared. Many of these works existed outside the public eye, distributed through secretive networks that operated in the shadows of respectable society. Rise of social movements. As the 19th century drew to a close, women began to challenge the deeply entrenched sexual double standards that had defined Victorian society. Feminist movements started to gain ground, with women demanding not only the right to vote, but also the right to control their own bodies and sexual desires. The fight for sexual freedom became a key aspect of the broader women's rights movement, as women sought to reclaim their autonomy from the patriarchal systems that had dominated them for centuries. The suffragette movement, in particular, was tied to these efforts. As women demanded the right to vote, they also began to call for broader social changes, including the right to sexual independence and the right to contraception. The rise of birth control and family planning activism challenged Victorian ideals of motherhood and sexual morality. Women, especially those from more progressive circles, sought to separate sex from reproduction and to assert their own sexual agency. By the end of the Victorian period, the moral framework that had held the era together began to show signs of crumbling. The increased visibility of feminist ideas, the continued existence of prostitution, and the growing advocacy for sexual freedom signaled the beginning of a shift in attitudes towards sex and sexuality. The rigid Victorian moral structure was slowly being replaced with a more complex and varied understanding of human desire, paving the way for the sexual revolutions of the 20th century. The legacy of the Victorian period is marked by its intense contradictions. On one hand, it was a time of extreme sexual repression and moral rigidity. On the other hand, it was a period of social experimentation, clandestine sexual cultures, and an undercurrent of rebellion. The Victorian obsession with controlling sexuality, whether through chastity devices, legal constraints, or the vilification of prostitutes, reveals a society grappling with its own fears, anxieties, and desires. In the end, it was this tension between repression and release that defined the era's sexual politics. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more interesting ones.